Despite the apparent success of the Crusader state, the Knights Templar still refused to acknowledge Frederick's treaty with the Sultan of Egypt, and they steadfastly pursued their own policies. The Templars opened negotiation with Egypt's rival, the Sultan of Damascus. The Templars believed the Egyptian empire was growing weak, a situation they felt the Crusaders should be exploiting to the full.
The fact is that the Muslim states of that region had other and far more important things to worry about. Most obviously the Mongols, who, unlike the Crusaders, did pose a mortal threat. Certainly were perceived as posing a mortal threat to the Muslim world, to the whole civilization of Islam. It was on an entirely different level, even compared with the First Crusade.
The Mongol Empire, created by Genghis Khan, had expanded across half a continent and now threatened the Islamic and Christian states. Fleeing the Mongol horde was an army called the Khwarizm, who also posed a grave threat to the Christian state. The westernmost Islamic leader, the Sultan of Damascus, felt most threatened, and he had accepted a non-aggression treaty with the Templars in which he gave them back their old castle of Safad. The Sultan of Egypt was stunned and immediately allied himself with the Khwarizm. The Crusader state was surrounded. The Khwarizm struck first, invading Palestine and attacking Damascus. The Christians assembled the largest force they could and together with the Sultan of Damascus took the field at La Fourbi. Their Muslim allies deserted and the Egyptians crushed the Christians in one of the most devastating battles of the century. "90% of the Templar force in the Holy Land had been killed at the Battle of La Fourbi. But many Christians, especially Frederick II, squarely blamed the Knights Templar for the catastrophe. The crisis deepened over the next few years as the weakened Crusader state lost some of its most powerful castles. Frederick accused the Templars of perpetuating war for their own ends. He claimed that the military order could not exist in peace, and that's why they had sabotaged his treaty with the Egyptians. Frederick was not the first to accuse the Knights Templar of warmongering, and he would not be the last. The King of France, Louis IX, was the first to respond to the Crusaders' frantic pleas for help. Louis arrived in the East in 1248 with a diverse contingent of European knights. Louis decided to follow the strategy of previous crusades, attempting to knock out Egypt before taking Jerusalem.
Unfortunately, it's very difficult to attack Egypt because of the Nile, because of the series of canals that crisscrossed the various branches of the Nile, and one couldn't necessarily move one's army across these branches all in one go. And there was one very important incident when the Templars, together with the Earl of Salisbury and Robert of Artois, who was a younger brother of King Louis IX of France, had already crossed one branch of the Nile and were opposite the Egyptian town of Mansoura. Robert of Artois, keen to gain glory, wanted to attack Mansoura. It would appear that the Templars wished to adopt their usual rather cautious policy and wait for the rest of the army. But when Robert of Artois insisted, using, as one chronicler said, foul and abusive words that were characteristic of the French, the Templars agreed to go along with this. But it proved to be a disaster because Mansoura was a town with small, tight streets, quite inappropriate for a mounted attack of the sort that the Count of Artois and the Templars were forced to make. And many of them were trapped in these narrow streets and were killed. So by the time the bulk of the army appeared, this had turned from what was planned to be a glorious attack into a rout.
The disaster of Mansourah had seen the entire vanguard of the Crusader army eliminated. Whatever the motivation for the Templar assault on Montserrat, the Templars had found themselves central to yet another catastrophe. They had lost 200 knights, and another Grand Master had been killed in battle. The retreating Christians were eventually surrounded, and Louis IX, the King of France, surrendered to the Egyptian Sultan. He was put up for an enormous ransom of 400,000 livres de Tours, at a time when the annual income of the entire Kingdom of France was 250,000 livres. Templar treasure ships waiting offshore were targeted by the king's entourage, but the Templars refused to release the money, as much of it had been deposited with them for safekeeping by other crusaders.
In fact, there wasn't any obvious conflict. A member of the king's entourage broke the locks of some of these trunks of money in the presence of the Templars, who made a symbolic objection. In that way, the Templars managed to maintain their integrity while still making a contribution towards the king's ransom.
Immediately on his release, Louis went to the Crusader city of Acre, where he remained for 4 years. Despite the Templars' support for the French king, they would not abandon their own policies in the Holy Land. While Louis hoped to make peace with Egypt, he caught the Templars negotiating once more with the Muslim city of Damascus. Louis was shocked and forced the Templars to submit and repent. When Louis IX eventually sailed for home, the Christian Holy Land lost not just his substantial resources, but also one of the few leaders who could unify the state and keep the Templars in line. Not long after, the Crusaders' situation took a turn for the worse. The Mongols were on the move again, and Egypt had undergone a coup, and a new power, the Mamluks, began carving an empire for itself. The Mamluks recognized the Mongols to be a far greater threat than the Christians. By the year 1260, the Mongols had sacked Baghdad, Aleppo, and Damascus, leaving no Islamic power east of the Christians. The ever-diminishing sliver of the Christian Holy Land stood between the world's two most powerful armies. Incredibly, the Crusaders allowed the Muslims to pass through their land en route to the Mongol hordes. At the Battle of Ain Jalut, it was the Mamluks who were victorious, inflicting the first major defeat on the Mongol Empire. The Crusader leaders quickly made peace with the victorious Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, but the Templars and the Hospitallers refused to hand over their lucrative Muslim prisoners of war. The Mamluks immediately retaliated. The Mamluk advance was slow but methodical and relentless.
The last campaigns of the crusading epic in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, are campaigns of siege warfare. The Crusaders are in their castles, in their fortified cities. In fact, essentially in their fortified cities. We can almost forget the castles at this last few decades. And the Muslim armies are seeking to take these powerfully defended, strongly walled, fortified cities and a few castles. Siege warfare is slow. It's before gunpowder, of course. So even though the Muslim armies were extremely sophisticated in this kind of warfare, it was a slow process.
In the early 1260s, the Mamluk concentrated on the southern Christian lands. In the late 1260s, they took Antioch and the Templars abandoned the enclave. In the 1270s, the Tripoli enclave crumbled. Only the arrival of Prince Edward of England, the future Edward I, with 10,000 Mongol allies, enabled a decade-long truce. But before the truce was up, the Mamluks decided to finish the Christians once and for all. In 1290, the Mamluks assembled 60,000 cavalry, 160,000 infantry, and 100 mangonel siege engines around the Christian capital of Acre. The temple compound was the last building to fall, and the Grand Master and all the remaining Templars were killed in the fighting. On August 14, 1291, the Knights Templars evacuated their last standing castle at Atlid and set up their new headquarters on Cyprus. The Templar castle of Atlid was the greatest they had ever built and had never been taken by siege. The Mamluks demolished it, so it could never again be used against the forces of Islam. The destruction of the last Crusader stronghold on the Holy Land was proof to many in the West that God no longer approved of such violence.
By the 13th century, the crusading ideal was recognized as something of a dream, an impossible dream. There were many who liked the idea as a sort of romantic, epic, heroic, religious concept. But as far as large numbers of the knightly elite, the educated classes and the rising bourgeoisie of the towns wanting to make sacrifices for this, the idea had become impractical. So I think it would be quite fair to say that the Templars and the other crusading orders were left high and dry.
The Knights Templar were now more vulnerable than they could possibly imagine. Their entire reason for being was the defense of the Holy Land, and they had failed. But the Templars were still an order of the Catholic Church. Any move against the Templars would be a direct assault on the papacy itself. While the Order of the Temple mustered its forces once more for yet another crusade against the Muslims, storm clouds were gathering back in Europe. The Order of the Temple of Solomon was about to find itself caught in the middle of a cataclysmic power struggle that would shake Western Europe to the very core.